There is a story the ancient Egyptians told about the day their entire species was nearly wiped out, not by a plague, not by an enemy army, by a single decision made by their own god that almost couldn't be undone. It started with an old king losing control. It nearly ended with nothing left to rule at all. And the only reason you exist to hear this story is a trick involving 7,000 jars of beer. This is the story of the goddess Ra created to save his throne, and then couldn't stop. By the time this story takes place, Ra had ruled over gods and humans for a very long time. He was the sun. Each day he crossed the sky, and each night he descended into the underworld and returned. But even a god who renews the sun every morning grows old. And the people of Kemet believed Ra had begun to grow old too. Tired, weaker, his authority slipping. Humans noticed. Before we go further, it's worth understanding the name at the center of this story, because the Egyptians chose it with precision. Sekhmet comes from the root Sekhem, meaning power or might. Her name isn't a description added after the fact, it's a title, the powerful one. Not the cruel one, not the vengeful one. Just power, stated plainly, without any judgment attached to whether that power was used to help or to destroy. That neutrality matters. It's going to explain almost everything that happens later in this story. Somewhere in Egypt, people began to talk, quietly at first, then less quietly. They said Ra was no longer fit to rule, that his age had made him weak, that the order he'd built, Maat itself, could survive without him. When Ra heard what they were saying, he didn't act right away. He did something almost unexpectedly careful for a god capable of ending the world with a word. He called a council. Nun, the primordial waters from which all creation emerged. Thoth, god of wisdom. Geb, the earth itself, given form. The oldest, most senior powers in existence gathered to advise him on what to do about a rebellion that hadn't even begun yet, only whispered. Their advice was unanimous and it was severe. Send your eye. In Egyptian belief, the eye of Ra wasn't just a body part. It was an independent force, a weapon, a daughter, a piece of Ra's own power capable of acting on its own, once released. Egyptologists have long noticed how closely this story echoes other ancient flood and near-extinction myths, from Mesopotamia's Atrahasis to the biblical account of Noah. The same basic shape recurring across unrelated civilizations. Humanity offends its creator, and only a narrow, arbitrary mercy keeps the species alive at all. What makes the Egyptian version distinct is what that mercy actually looks like, and we'll get there. The council told Ra exactly who to send, not himself, not a warning. As Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, and music, herself capable of a much darker aspect, to descend and remind humanity exactly what they owed their allegiance to. Ra agreed. Hathor descended into the desert hills where the conspirators had gathered. What happened next is described in the original funerary texts in language that still unsettles modern readers. She didn't warn them. She didn't negotiate. She began to kill. And as she killed, something in her began to change. The goddess of love and joy transformed mid-slaughter into something else entirely, a lioness-headed force of pure violence. The Egyptians gave this new aspect its own name, Sekhmet. The choice of a lioness wasn't arbitrary either. In the Nile Valley, the lion was the apex predator, the animal every Egyptian understood, on a gut level, to be capable of ending a human life in seconds, without warning, without mercy, and without any interest in negotiation. Giving that violence, a lioness's head wasn't decoration. It was the most honest visual language available for what unrestrained divine force actually looks like from the receiving end. She moved through the rebels like fire through dry grass. And by the time she returned to Ra, she wasn't apologetic. She wasn't even satisfied in a way that suggested the job was finished. The ancient text has her describe the killing in her own words, that overpowering mankind had been, in her own phrasing, agreeable to her heart. Some translations render it even more bluntly, that wading in their blood was, to her, a source of genuine pleasure. The surviving copy of this text in the Egyptian Museum of Turin, along with the fuller versions carved into the tomb walls of Seti I and Rameses II and III, all describe her in nearly identical terms, a being who doesn't merely follow through on violence, but who is transformed, and in some sense, completed by it. Every surviving depiction of Sekhmet from this period shows her crowned with a solar disk and a rearing cobra, the same royal symbols worn by Ra himself, a visual reminder that this wasn't a separate monster acting against Ra's wishes. This was Ra's own fire, given a body, doing exactly what fire does once it's allowed to spread unchecked. Ra had asked for a punishment. What he got was a goddess who had discovered she enjoyed this. He told her, "That's enough. Hold off. Stop." She didn't stop. This is the part of the myth that tends to surprise people most, because it isn't a story about a god exercising perfect control over his own creation. It's a story about a god realizing, in real time, that he has made something he cannot simply switch off. Sekhmet continued south, deeper into Egypt, continuing the slaughter Ra had never actually authorized to this degree. The text describes her wading through blood, and Ra, watching his own punishment spiral past the point he'd intended, had to improvise. He couldn't fight her. He couldn't outpower her. She was quite literally made from his own power, and no force in the Egyptian cosmos was described as greater than the eye of Ra itself. So he did something far stranger than a battle. He sent runners, described in the text as messengers, as fast as a body's own shadow, all the way to Elephantine, near Egypt's southern border, to gather red ochre in bulk. He had it ground by the high priest of Heliopolis personally, not left to a lesser hand. He ordered barley crushed for beer by an army of maidservants working through the entire night, racing a deadline none of them had been told the true reason for. The result: 7,000 jars of beer, dyed blood red with ochre, and in some versions of the text, mixed with mandrake root, a plant the Egyptians associated with sedation. Then, under cover of darkness, it was carried out and poured across the field Sekhmet was expected to cross at first light, flooding the land in something that, from a distance, in the dim color of dawn, would look exactly like the aftermath of a massacre already finished. There was no guarantee this would work. Ra wasn't relying on strength here. He'd already established he had none to spare against her. He was relying on a gamble, that a goddess drunk on bloodlust, moving fast and expecting exactly this kind of carnage, wouldn't look closely enough at what she was about to drink before she drank it. At dawn, Sekhmet arrived at the flooded fields, ready to continue exactly where she'd left off. She saw red as far as she could see, and she didn't stop to question it. She drank, not cautiously, completely. The text is specific about the number: 7,000 jars, consumed until the goddess who had nearly ended humanity overnight simply couldn't continue. She grew drunk, then disoriented, then finally collapsed into sleep in the middle of the very fields she'd meant to soak in real blood. When she woke, something had shifted. The bloodlust that had driven her was gone, burned out by the drink, or perhaps satisfied by the illusion of having finished the job completely. She rose again as Hathor, the goddess of joy and love, restored, with no memory, in the myth's telling, of ever having stopped. Humanity survived, because a divine act of fury was interrupted by nothing more dramatic than being tricked into a hangover. Ra, watching this resolution, made his own decision immediately after. He was done ruling directly among humans who could conspire against him and nearly cost the world everything over a rumor about his age. He ascended into the sky, carried on the back of a great cosmic cow. The heavenly cow the entire myth takes its name from, putting real, permanent distance between gods and mortals for the first time in Egyptian cosmology. Kingship on earth would continue through pharaohs, his living representatives, but the gods themselves would never again rule quite this close, or quite this personally. And every year afterward, the Egyptians held a festival to commemorate the day they nearly didn't survive their own god's anger. A festival of drunkenness, where beer stained red with pomegranate juice was consumed in Sekhmet and Hathor's honor, deliberately reenacting the very trick that had once saved them. It's one of the clearest examples in Egyptian religion of a myth, directly producing a real, dated, annually repeated ritual. One modern Egyptologists have traced in temple records for well over 1,000 years of continuous practice. Here is what makes Sekhmet unlike almost anything else in the Egyptian pantheon. You'd expect a goddess responsible for something this close to a species-ending event to be feared and avoided, kept at the edges of religious life, approached only with dread. Instead, the opposite happened, and it happened almost immediately in the historical record. Sekhmet became one of the most actively worshipped, actively petitioned goddesses in all of Kemet, because the same fire that could destroy could, if channeled correctly, heal. Egyptian physicians were quite literally priests of Sekhmet. Medicine and her cult weren't separate institutions, they were the same institution, under the same roof, answering to the same authority. Surviving titles from tomb inscriptions record men holding positions like overseer of the physicians of Sekhmet, passed down through entire families, father to son to grandson, as a hereditary medical profession. Treating a wound, curing a fever, warding off plague, all of it fell under her authority, because the Egyptians reasoned that whoever had the power to send disease in the first place was the only one with the standing to take it away again. She also became, quite deliberately, a war goddess in her own right. Pharaohs adopted her image as a battle standard, most famously Ramesses II, who is depicted at the Battle of Kadesh, with Sekhmet's image scorching his enemies from his own war chariot, her flames rendered directly onto the temple relief as an extension of his royal power. And no pharaoh understood her dual nature more urgently or more personally than Amenhotep III. Amenhotep commissioned somewhere over 600 statues of Sekhmet. Some estimates place the number closer to 700, placed throughout his mortuary temple at Kom el Haytan and the Mut temple complex at Karnak. Modern Egyptologists have a theory about why he needed quite so many. His reign coincided with a series of serious epidemics moving through the wider Near East, and Amenhotep, growing genuinely ill himself in his later years, may have been doing exactly what Ra once did, on a much larger, more desperate scale, trying to manage a force too dangerous to fight directly by appeasing it. One statue, one daily offering, one repeated ritual at a time, for every single day of the year. In one delta city, Leontopolis, the Greeks who later visited Egypt recorded something even stranger. Living lions, kept and tended in captivity, treated as literal, breathing images of the goddess herself. The distinction between symbol and presence, in Sekhmet's case, was never entirely clear, and that may have been intentional. Sekhmet didn't just survive her own myth of near extinction. She became the thing an entire civilization turned to, generation after generation. For nearly 2,000 years, whenever life itself felt like it was slipping out of their hands. There's one more piece of this story that rarely gets told alongside it, and it changes how the whole myth reads. The Egyptians didn't just worship Sekhmet's fury. They also worshipped what she looked like once that fury had cooled. Bastet, the cat-headed goddess of the home, protection, and fertility, wasn't a separate, unrelated figure. In the earliest periods of Egyptian religion, Bastet herself was depicted as a lioness, nearly indistinguishable from Sekhmet. Over centuries, as her cult centered on the delta city of Bubastes grew gentler in character, her image softened from lioness to domestic cat, while Sekhmet retained the full, untamed weight of the original power. Egyptologists frequently describe the two as two ends of a single spectrum, sometimes even calling Bastet the pacified aspect of the same Eye of Ra that Sekhmet represents at full intensity. One goddess for the fire that's been welcomed inside the house and fed by the hearth. One goddess for the same fire, still burning out in the desert, unattended. Even Sekhmet's family reflects this same duality, deliberately rather than by accident. In Memphis, she was worshipped as the wife of Ptah, the calm, methodical god of craftsmen and creation, the steadiest, least volatile figure in the entire pantheon. Together, Egyptian belief held their son was Nefertum, a young god associated with the lotus flower, healing fragrance, and the first light of morning. A destroyer, a craftsman, and a flower, bound together as a single divine household. It's difficult to imagine a more deliberate statement about what the Egyptians believed power was actually for, once it had somewhere safe to rest. So here's the question worth sitting with. Every civilization has gods of destruction. Egypt certainly had others. Set, chaos given form. Apep, the serpent that threatened the sun every night. But those figures stayed roughly where you'd expect them. Dangerous, external, something to be defended against, never invited closer. Sekhmet is different, and it's worth asking why. Maybe it's because the Egyptians understood something we still find uncomfortable to say out loud, that the forces capable of ending you and the forces capable of saving you are very often not two different things. They're the same force at different intensities, in different hands. Fire that burns a village to the ground is the same fire that cooks the food keeping a family alive through winter. The sun that scorches a failed harvest is the same sun the entire civilization depended on for every successful one before it. Even her own name refuses to take a side, the powerful one. Nothing more specific than that, because power itself was never the problem. What you did with it was. Sekhmet wasn't worshipped despite nearly ending humanity. She was worshipped because of it, because the Egyptians had watched, in their own mythology, exactly how close that fire could come to consuming everything, and concluded that the only sane response wasn't to pretend that danger away, or to imagine they could ever fully extinguish it. It was to build an ongoing relationship with it, feed it, appease it, ask it, respectfully and repeatedly, for 2,000 years, to heal instead of harm. Maybe that's a more honest way to survive a dangerous world than believing you could ever fully tame it. Ra built Sekhmet to save his throne and nearly lost the entire world in the process. The only reason any of us are here to tell this story is that a goddess capable of ending humanity was, in the end, just thirsty enough to stop.